Hey guys, what's up? So today I'm going to be looking at this new Firefly Les Paul style guitar, and I'm also wanting to talk about cheap or inexpensive guitars, what they are, what they aren't, and which ones should you be looking at to get the most bang for your buck. So stay tuned. All right, so first up, let's go ahead and talk about this guitar. This is a Firefly. They're sold on guitarsgarden.com. These usually clock in at the sub $200 level. And to be honest, I don't think I've ever played a guitar that is, I guess, authentic feeling, if that's even a thing, as this guitar, especially in that price range. Now, that doesn't mean that this guitar, I didn't do anything to it. Far from it, actually. But we're going to get into this a little bit later. What I did to this guitar, I didn't have to do to make it playable or to make it comfortable or even sound good. But what I did do was for personal taste. So let's go over what that was. So as you can see, this is the FFSP. Used to be called the FFLP. I think they changed it from LP just to kind of avoid certain litigious companies from coming after them. But, these guitars are made in China. The company themselves, though, is, from what I can tell, situated stateside. Now, this is like the Black Beauty Les Paul style. We got, the full block inlays all the way up the fretboard. It's got the gold trim. It's got the full binding back and front. It's a thick guitar. It's a heavy guitar. Supposedly they're made out of mahogany, but if you look at the wood on the inside, it looks a little light to be mahogany, honestly. It's got an actual bone nut, which is cool. Something you don't even see on some higher end PRS guitars, or not higher end PRS, but like the SE series from PRS has plastic nuts. And this thing at sub 200 comes with a bone nut. That's pretty good. Typically, this hardware, if I was gonna be a little nitpicky, I would say it was a little rough around the edges, but it's perfectly functional, and it's not loose. There's nothing fatally flawed about it. The tuners that came with it, I'll get into why I replaced those in a minute. The ones that came with it, though, they were these Grover style tuners that worked pretty well. In fact, they felt just as good to me as some of the Grover stuff you would get on a Les Paul. Again, a little rough around the edges on the finish, but internally the mechanism worked just fine. The pickups, when I got this guitar, sounded great, but they were extremely microphonic, especially the neck pickup. Now, the bridge pickup, it wasn't too bad, but it had this really nice, bitey kind of top end and rich sound, especially in the room. Now, I took it out. Why? When it sounded so good? Well, I decided because of the microphonics, I was going to repot the pickups. So I, melted some wax. I dipped them, and it totally fixed the microphonic issue, especially with the neck pickup, which I kept. However, the character of this pickup did fundamentally change. The things that I was liking about it, especially with the high gain stuff, it just all of a sudden kind of dulled and got a little less musical sounding, if that makes sense. I don't know. That seems like one of those buzzwords that people throw around, but it did. It just totally changed the character of the pickup. I'm realizing that when a pickup is slightly microphonic and it acts more like a microphone, you're getting a lot more of the frequency response of the strings coming through that component. And I think I was actually liking how that was sounding, but once it was fixed, wasn't quite hitting the same notes for me. So I had this dimarzio tone zone already kind of on hand. I went ahead and I just threw this in there. And if you don't know anything about the tone zone that dimarzio makes, it was developed for Eddie Van Halen back when It's based off of what they consider a broken Seymour Duncan JB. It's basically mismatched coils, but it's got a similar output to like a JB, and it sounds a lot like a JB. It's got the Alnico magnet, and to me, it's like one of the best passive pickups you can actually own if you like that flavor and sound, and it really does match up with this neck pickup pretty well. And beyond that, I did swap the tuners that were decent for some locking ones. These are some inexpensive Music Lily branded locking tuners from Amazon. I found these to be pretty bang for your buck. They're kind of somewhat on par with the Tone Ninja stuff for a little bit cheaper. Gold hardware, kept it, the aesthetic the same. And beyond that, I didn't really have to do anything else to this guitar. Even in terms of frets, all the fret ends, perfectly fine. In terms of fret levelness, I think there was 2 frets on here that I gave a minor spot leveling to just to make that rocker, that my fret rocker a little bit flatter. Just, probably didn't need to even do it that much. You probably could have got away with not doing that and it would have been fine. And so, long story short, I haven't been able to really put this guitar down. It feels and looks and has a lot of the qualities that you would want out of any heavy ass Les Paul style guitar. If you were going to compare this to like an Epiphone, I would say this has a better build quality than most sub $1,000 Epiphones that I've played. In fact, I had an Epiphone Prophecy for a while. That was a really nice guitar, really good. Loved it. It had at least 4 or 5 things about it that I had to actually get in and fix. I had to do a full fret level on that guitar to really make it where it should be for the price point. This guitar is not like that. The finish on this guitar, like the actual finish, not the paint. This is a black guitar, so the paint's going to be pretty consistent. But, I imagine this is some sort of polyurethane finish. It's definitely one of those things that if you know what you're looking for when it comes to high-end finishes, if you've ever worked with car paint or any other kind of paint medium, this is a pretty cheap polyurethane, enough that even the faintest kind of scuff kind of shows up. It came to me with a little bit of swirl action going on, just kind of the run-of-the-mill use wear, handling wear, I would call it, not necessarily use. Now, that's something that you don't quite see on something like an Epiphone. I think their polyurethane finishes are a bit more robust, a bit better applied. There's no runs or any kind of weird stuff like that, but it's definitely not a high-end finish. Now, I'm a little biased. I like poly finishes. I think the nitro finishes that Gibson does, while they look cool, over time they just get kind of weird. They don't feel the greatest, in my opinion. I know some people like them. I'm just not one of those people. In terms of that, you're not going to get that high quality nitro look out of a guitar like this. You're just not. But with that said, $200 or less, it's nothing to write home about. So let me go ahead and pull up an amp plugin and let's see how this thing sounds. All right, so today I'm pulling up the Archetype Rabia from Neural DSP. It's one that I've been really into lately. It does the high gain stuff. It does the clean stuff really well. In fact, it does the clean stuff almost too well, to the point that I don't ever use anything else for clean or kind of textural crunch tones other than this plugin, typically. So first off, I'm just going to dive into the high gain. I'm not going to go into the clean. I'm not going to do the clean crunch high gain thing. Let's just do the high gain real quick so you can hear this tone zone in action on this setting. So yeah, pretty cool, crunchy, high gain tone from the out of the tone zone with this Rabia plugin. Let's go to like some cool clean thing. The Rabia plugin's just got a lot of cool presets. You don't really have to do much to get a good tone out of it. And so one of the things I like about this combination here, the stock pickup is actually a ceramic magnet pickup. It's pretty cool sounding. I do prefer Alnico magnets overall, but it's got a little bit of like a top end sparkle to it. It's a much darker and scoop sounding pickup than the Tone Zone. The Tone Zone is super mid forward. I mean, I think you can even on the clean tones just hear that, you know, the difference at the neck, on the middle. You get to the bridge. It's a little bit of night and day, but the mix in between the two on the middle position, pretty cool sound. Again, that's kind of a custom setup with the pickup configuration. If you were to get this guitar stock, you would be dealing with this guy, which also has a bit more mid-range than the neck, but it's also a ceramic magnet, a little scooped, not quite as mid-forward as the Tone Zone. Stability on this thing is fantastic. Tuning's fantastic. The feel. You know, if I go to like a crunchy setting, which the Rabia has a lot of, yeah, let's go with the crispy Brit setting. And like anytime you add gain to something, what you get is a lot of the tonal EQ differences. So that scoop sound out of the neck and that mid-forward sound out of the bridge become much more even. More gain. You're basically compressing those frequencies into a much tighter space, and you're getting all that tone in between the peaks kind of leveling out. And so I think with high gain or any kind of gain application, these pickups actually complement each other pretty well. So beyond this guitar, you know, being a great purchase for the price point, you know, it's the company Guitars Garden or the brand Firefly isn't without its detractors. There are people who definitely have some qualms with a little bit of the inconsistency in some of the more fancy colors that the company offers. They kind of blew up in popularity a little bit a year or so ago during the pandemic when they offered a 30-inch, you know, bass 6 style baritone guitar build that was, you know, on the same level as, you know, some of the stuff that you were seeing come out of Britain with like the Sub-Zeros, and, you know, can compete with like the Squier bass 6. But those guitars, I guess, tended to have a little bit of some QC, you know, stuff. I never got to play one. I did have a Sub-Zero for a while. I thought it had a pretty good fit and feel. It was definitely not the most refined feeling guitar. You know, knowing that these guitars, you know, they're made on CNC machines, they're kind of hit or miss with certain aspects of what they do. What about, you know, a brand like Squier, where you have, you know, an established company like Fender backing it up, and you still have similar price points, and, you know, you have big communities who really gravitate towards these. Well, I've owned a handful of Squiers. In fact, I think if you look over, I'll post a link. I did a review of the Sonic series Squier that came out this last year to replace the Bullet series, and it was a fantastic guitar. I mean, it was made in Indonesia. It had a great neck, a great feel, and, you know, it was one of those things that you could easily flip into a guitar that's resellable at the price point that you bought it for, maybe even a little bit more. You know, I had a Seymour Duncan Invader in it. I did some black hardware swap outs, and it, you know, was easy to kind of put out there and get rid of. But it was a great guitar. I would definitely buy one again. I also had an Affinity Telecaster, you know, one in like that butterscotch yellow color. It was a fantastic finish on that guitar. The stain, it didn't look like that TV yellow Gibson thing. It was a much more warm looking and very cool yellow guitar. If I have a picture of it, I'll throw it up. I went ahead and I put in some Fender pickups in that. Sounded great. That guitar actually was made in China. A more expensive guitar than even the Sonic series. And yet it was made in, you know, what people seem to perceive as being like a lower quality import building site. But, you know, it's a more expensive guitar. And to be fair, the neck, I did have to do a bit of leveling on those frets to make them a little bit more playable, especially around the 12th fret area. So, like, with that, you know, even established brands, you know, these legacy brands do have their quirks. So what about a brand like Harley Benton, who has just exploded onto the scene? You know, I went ahead and I acquired a Harley Benton JA20, one of the active series guitars. I'll put a picture of it up somewhere. And I was rocking that for a while. In fact, I think I made a video of, you know, playing on that guitar through a plugin. And so that guitar was super comfortable to play, but this is where the whole cheap guitar thing kind of becomes kind of interesting, because a lot of people see cheap or inexpensive guitars and they think, well, this would be a good beginner guitar. I would say, on average, a Squier is a pretty good beginner guitar. I would say, on average, an Epiphone is a pretty good beginner guitar, although lately I'm kind of on the fence about that, because some of these guitars are getting pretty up there in price, and some of the issues that you're seeing are pretty unacceptable at that price point. And I wouldn't necessarily say that there are things that would be good for someone who's just learning to have to deal with. And that is where Harley Benton really kind of gets the kind of vote for me, because I got this JA20. I knew that there was going to be some issues based on what I've seen online. And what I got was interesting, to say the least. Now, everybody was pretty aware of the fact that Harley Benton used non-conductive paint on the back of these models' bridges, and that they weren't being grounded quite correctly, so you're getting a 60-cycle hum when you shouldn't have been. The strings weren't grounded. But that was easy to fix. I pulled it apart and immediately, you know, did a little scuff and fixed that problem outright. The real problem with that guitar is the electronics, and I pulled them out because I had to replace them, and I just happened to have them on hand. These HBZ actives, these things are terrible. I mean, it takes a lot for me to say something's bad. Like, there's always tolerance with everything. Like, there's stuff that can be found to be okay, and there's stuff that can be found to be kind of meh. Those HBZs, throw them in the trash. I mean, I've played on non-branded actives. In fact, my Jackson that I had non-branded actives that sounded pretty good. Almost sounded like EMGs. I just wanted a different flavor, so I installed Fishmans. The preamps in these are junk. They have such a high noise floor. And I'm not talking about the noise you got from being ungrounded. I'm talking about the fact that there's like a preamp like level inside the pickup that is operating at a level above what should be an acceptable noise floor for an active pickup. Like, they're just not good. And maybe there are some that are, but these ones weren't. The other thing about that guitar, the stock tuning pegs are some of the worst machine ones I've ever felt. Like, I could literally almost make a full turn before it would catch and actually start to rotate the peg. That's pretty bad. I ripped those out. I put in some hip shots, great tuners, by the way. I put in some Jim Root EMGs, because, it was a Jazz Master style guitar. Why not make it look like a Jazz Master, Jim Root from, Fender? That pretty much alleviated all the issues with that guitar. The only other thing about that guitar that was super weird is the truss rod. I ended up having to tighten the truss rod to get the neck from backbowing so much that I don't think I had much more room to go. But I got it straightened out, and I got it, to where I could actually set it up. So when it comes down to cheap guitars and whether or not a cheap guitar is good for a beginner, most cheap guitars actually probably aren't great for beginners. In fact, I remember some old Squier guitars that I had, back in the early 2000s that were absolutely hard as hell to play on because they just didn't have any good quality control. This is a pretty good guitar for a beginner. It just looks a bit, over the head of like most beginning players. I think they might get a little intimidated by a guitar that looks like this because it doesn't really look like what you would think is a beginning guitar. Harley Bentons, they have some guitars that are fantastic. They have some guitars that are absolute trash. They have some guitars that are good once you put the work into them. The problem with that is for a beginner, someone who's just learning to play, if the guitar is hard to play, if the guitar doesn't feel good, it's going to stifle their ability to actually learn. Not only that, if you actually have to put work into the guitar that you just paid $160 to $200 for is going to need about $200 to $300 worth of work to become playable. You probably could have spent about $500 on a better guitar for your beginning player, and they are probably going to benefit much more from that particular purchase. So what are these cheap guitars really, though? And who are they really meant for? Well, more and more I'm looking at the forums, I'm looking at, the places on social media, and this guitar and the Harley Bentons for sure, and almost any other sub $200 guitar that you find, be it on like Amazon or the AliExpress or some of these sites that cater to mass production, these are for the people that actually play guitar and really like to do modification projects. There are many places on the internet that you can find these people like myself who love doing mod projects and will buy up these cheap guitars and put expensive components in them and, enjoy them immensely. And you get the detractors who go, why not just spend the money on a better guitar from the, out the gate? Well, then I wouldn't get to have all the fun doing the tinkering and all the electronics, the stuff that I actually enjoy doing. So there is an element of that to it. But more and more you're seeing that these cheaper guitar companies, and I'm going to say Firefly, in my most recent experience, is probably the best so far. They're producing instruments that are well above the quality threshold of even some of the established brands, and putting like a couple $100 set of pickups in this guitar doesn't feel like a waste of time when this guitar plays as well as any Epiphone, and maybe plays as good as my Gibson Les Paul Studio that's over in its case that I haven't touched in months, because I'm actually going to end up getting the longevity and the mileage out of playing this, and I don't feel like I have to necessarily coddle it while it's being, thrown around on a stage or something like that. I don't know. This video is a bit more about my opinions than anything else, but to be honest, in the hierarchy of going out there and finding inexpensive guitars, I would say look at the Harley Benton stuff. Avoid the active series stuff unless you really want that aesthetic, knowing that you're going to have to do some work. But if you're looking at something with a little bit more of a classic look that's mostly, passive electronics, the Firefly stuff is pretty damn good. Mediocre finish, kind of rough around the edges hardware, but build quality and fit and some of the features are pretty fantastic for the price. They have other shapes, they have Strats, Tellies, they have SG looking stuff. They have some more eccentric looking shapes like, they do V's. They also do Explorer styles. They have a large selection of like the E335 hollow body stuff. Give them a look. Other than that, if you're going to go more big box store type, nowadays I would say that the Squiers punch above their prices a lot better than the Epiphones do. The Epiphones have gotten a bit overpriced for what they offer. But again, you definitely get a bigger bang for your buck out of most top tier Epiphones than you will out of the mid range or even low range Gibson stuff. Just in my experience playing, off the shelf. So anyway, I'm gonna leave you with some more tones here out of this guitar. And if you have any comments, suggestions, feelings, leave them leave them down below. Thanks.